Have you ever sat at a family dinner table, surrounded by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, and felt more alone than you've ever felt in your entire life? Have you ever smiled politely while your heart was shattering into 1,000 pieces, pretending that their words weren't cutting through you like knives? Well, let me tell you about the Thanksgiving dinner that completely transformed my life. The moment when I finally understood that seeking approval from people who refuse to see the real you is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. It was November 15th, and the autumn air carried that familiar crisp scent of dying leaves and approaching winter. I remember driving to my parents' house that evening, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, rehearsing in my mind all the things I promised myself I wouldn't let bother me this time. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the trees lining their suburban street, and with each passing house decorated with fall wreaths and pumpkins, I felt my anxiety building like a pressure cooker ready to explode. My stomach churned with that old, familiar dread, the same feeling I'd carried with me since childhood, whenever I knew I was about to face the collective judgment of my family. You see, I'd spent 28 years trying to be the person they wanted me to be, molding myself into their vision of success, swallowing my true desires like bitter pills, and that particular evening, I was about to discover that I simply couldn't do it anymore. As I pulled into the driveway, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked tired, weary from years of internal battles, and there was a sadness there that I'd become so accustomed to, I barely noticed it anymore. I was wearing clothes I'd carefully selected to be acceptable but not too different, neutral enough not to spark comments, but still somewhat representative of who I was trying to become. Even my choice of outfit was a compromise, a negotiation with their expectations. And looking back now, I see how exhausting it was to constantly calculate every single aspect of my presentation to minimize their disapproval. The house looked exactly as it always did, that perfect picture of suburban respectability with its manicured lawn, matching shutters, and the family sedan parked in its designated spot. Everything in its place, everything controlled, everything exactly as tradition dictated it should be. I took 3 deep breaths before getting out of the car, a coping mechanism I'd learned from therapy, trying to center myself and remember that I was an adult, that I had the right to exist as I chose, that their opinions didn't define my worth. But those affirmations felt hollow, like words I was desperately trying to believe but couldn't quite internalize yet. The moment I walked through that front door, the familiar smell of my mother's cooking hit me, that complicated mixture of roasted turkey and underlying tension that seemed to permeate every family gathering. My mother greeted me with her usual tight hug and that look, the one that scanned me from head to toe in approximately 3 seconds, cataloging every detail that didn't meet her standards. I could see the slight disapproval in the tightening around her eyes when she noticed my hair, which I'd recently cut shorter than she liked, and the small frown when her gaze landed on my choice of shoes, apparently too casual for her definition of proper family dinner attire. My father was in the living room, barely looking up from his newspaper, offering a grunt that I'd learned to interpret as his version of a greeting. My older brother Marcus was already there with his wife Jennifer and their 2 perfectly behaved children, and the contrast between their picture-perfect family and my single, unconventional life was something I knew would be highlighted throughout the evening in both subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Marcus had followed the script perfectly: prestigious college, corporate job, traditional marriage, house in the suburbs, 2.5 kids. He was the golden child, the standard against which I was constantly measured and perpetually found lacking. My younger sister Amanda arrived shortly after me, and I could see in her eyes that same trapped feeling I carried, though she was still years away from the realization that would eventually set her free. The dinner table was set with my mother's good china, the same dishes that had witnessed decades of family meals, each plate positioned with mathematical precision, each fork and knife aligned perfectly. We took our assigned seats, the same positions we'd occupied since childhood, as if even our physical placement in the room was predetermined and unchangeable. The conversation started innocuously enough, the usual surface-level exchanges about weather and work and traffic, everyone dancing around the topics that really mattered, everyone performing their designated roles in this elaborate family theater. But then, as it always did, the conversation turned to me, to my life choices, to my continued deviation from the path they'd laid out for me before I was even old enough to have a say in the matter. My Aunt Carol, who never missed an opportunity to offer unsolicited opinions, asked about my job with that particular tone that suggested she already knew she wouldn't approve of the answer. I was working as a freelance writer and content creator, building something meaningful on my own terms, but to her and most of my family, Anything that didn't involve a traditional 9-to-5 job with benefits and a clear corporate hierarchy was essentially unemployment dressed up with fancy words. I explained, as I had explained countless times before, that I was doing well, that I was happy, that I was building a career that aligned with my values and passions. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by what I can only describe as pitying looks exchanged across the table. Then Marcus, in that condescending tone he'd perfected over the years, launched into what he probably thought was helpful advice about the importance of stability and thinking about my future and how creative pursuits were fine as hobbies, but real adults needed real jobs. Each word felt like a small betrayal, coming from someone who had once been my closest confidant during childhood, before the weight of family expectations had transformed him into their spokesperson. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with concern that barely masked her disappointment, talking about how worried she was about me, how she couldn't sleep at night thinking about my lack of security, how all her friends' children had respectable careers, and when was I going to stop this phase and settle down into something proper? The word phase hit me particularly hard because I'd been living my authentic life for 3 years at that point. 3 years of hard work and personal growth, and she still saw it as something temporary, something I would eventually grow out of like a teenager's rebellious haircut. The conversation continued to spiral, each family member adding their perspective on what was wrong with my life choices, and I sat there feeling smaller and smaller, shrinking under the weight of their collective disappointment. My father finally spoke up, not to defend me, but to add his voice to the chorus of concern, talking about how in his day, people knew the value of hard work and commitment, and following through with responsible choices. The implication was clear. I was lazy. I was irresponsible. I was a disappointment. Jennifer, my sister-in-law, tried to soften the blow by suggesting maybe I just needed to meet the right person who would help me see the value in a more traditional lifestyle, as if my entire identity and career choices were simply the result of not having a man to guide me properly. The condescension in her voice, that sweet poison of someone who genuinely believes they're helping while simultaneously dismissing everything you are, was almost harder to bear than the outright criticism. Then came the moment that changed everything. The comment that finally shattered whatever fragile hope I'd been clinging to that someday they might accept me. My Uncle Robert, emboldened by a few glasses of wine and the supportive audience around him, started laughing, actually laughing, at the description of my work. He made a joke about how I was basically playing on the internet all day and calling it a career, how his generation had built real things with their hands, how my lifestyle was a perfect example of everything wrong with my generation. The table erupted in laughter, not the kind of warm, inclusive laughter that brings families together, but that cruel, mocking laughter that excludes and diminishes. Even my mother was smiling, shaking her head in that way that suggested she found the whole situation simultaneously amusing and tragic. I looked around at their faces, at these people who shared my blood and my history, and something inside me cracked wide open. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, but rather a quiet, profound shift, like a lock finally clicking open after years of trying the wrong key. In that moment, surrounded by their laughter and their judgment and their absolute certainty that they knew better than me how I should live my life, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. I would never, ever be good enough for them as long as I insisted on being myself. Their approval wasn't something I could earn through achievement or explanation, or any amount of trying to meet their standards, because their standards required me to fundamentally deny who I was. The realization didn't bring immediate relief. Instead, it brought a wave of grief so profound it nearly took my breath away. I was grieving the family I'd always hoped I had, the unconditional love I'd believed was somewhere beneath their criticism, the acceptance I'd been chasing my entire life like a mirage that kept receding every time I got close. I felt tears building behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply they'd wounded me. I excused myself from the table, mumbling something about needing the bathroom, and locked myself in the small powder room off the hallway, where I'd hidden so many times as a child, when the weight of their expectations became too much to bear. I stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink, really looked at myself for what felt like the first time in years. Who was this person staring back at me? Was I the failure they saw? Or was I something else entirely, something they were simply incapable of recognizing or valuing? My hands were shaking as I gripped the edge of the sink, and I could hear their continued laughter and conversation drifting down the hallway. Life going on as if they hadn't just collectively destroyed me. But here's the thing about breaking points. They're called that because something breaks. And what broke in me that evening wasn't my spirit, but rather the chains of need and desperation that had bound me to their approval for so long. Growing up in that house, in that family, there was never a moment when I felt truly free to be myself. From my earliest memories, there was always this sense of being watched, evaluated, measured against an invisible standard that I could never quite reach. I remember being 7 years old, sitting in the back seat of our family car, listening to my parents discuss my report card with a level of intensity that seemed wildly disproportionate to the stakes involved. I'd gotten mostly A's with 1 B in mathematics, and you would have thought I'd committed some cardinal sin from the disappointment in their voices. My father kept saying things like, "You're capable of more," and "good isn't good enough in this family," while my mother worried aloud about what this might mean for my future college prospects. I was 7 years old, and they were already mapping out my entire life trajectory, already panicking that I might deviate from their master plan. That B in mathematics became a symbol of everything I would come to represent in their eyes: potential squandered, standards not met, disappointment embodied. The pressure intensified as I got older, transforming from general expectations into specific mandates about who I should be and what I should want. There were the acceptable hobbies and the ones that were dismissed as wastes of time. I loved creative writing, would spend hours filling notebooks with stories and poems, and my parents tolerated it the way you might tolerate a child's imaginary friend, something cute but ultimately meaningless that they assumed I would outgrow. What they encouraged, what they valued, were the activities that looked good on college applications: debate team, volunteer work at acceptable organizations, leadership positions in established clubs. Everything had to serve the ultimate goal of getting into a top-tier university, which would lead to a prestigious career, which would result in the kind of respectable adult life they could brag about to their friends. My mother had a particular vision for who I should become, and she wasn't subtle about communicating it. She'd clip articles from magazines about successful women in business or medicine or law, leaving them strategically placed where I couldn't miss them, as if exposure to these stories would somehow rewire my interests and ambitions. She'd make comments about the daughters of her friends, always highlighting the ones who were following traditional paths to success, always with this underlying message that this was what good daughters did. This was how you made your parents proud. My father was less direct but perhaps more damaging in his approach. He simply expected excellence without discussion, as if the pressure of his unspoken disappointment was enough to shape my behavior. When I brought home achievements that didn't align with his narrow definition of success, he'd give me that look, that subtle expression of dismissal that communicated more clearly than words ever could that what I'd accomplished didn't matter, didn't count, wasn't the right kind of achievement. I learned early that love in my family was conditional, doled out in proportion to how well you conform to expectations. My brother Marcus figured this out before I did, maybe because he was older, or maybe because his natural inclinations aligned more closely with what they wanted anyway. He learned to play the game perfectly, to perform the role of ideal son with an ease that I simultaneously envied and pitied. Watching him receive their praise and approval for simply being who they wanted him to be created a complicated mix of emotions in me. Jealousy that it came so easily to him, resentment that the same approval seemed forever out of my reach, and a growing awareness that maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with me for not being able or willing to do the same. Family dinners throughout my childhood and adolescence were exercises in maintaining acceptable personas. We'd sit around that same table, and everyone would perform their designated roles: the successful father, the devoted mother, the accomplished son, the promising daughter. Any deviation from the script was met with swift correction, sometimes through direct criticism, but more often through subtle signals of disapproval, uncomfortable silences, or strategic changes of subject. I learned to read these signals with the precision of someone navigating a minefield, always alert, always calculating, always trying to anticipate which version of myself would be most acceptable in any given moment. The really insidious thing about growing up under constant judgment is how it becomes internalized. Their voices took up residence in my head, a running commentary on everything I did, every choice I made, every desire I felt. I'd want to pursue something that excited me, and immediately I'd hear my mother's concerned voice asking if it was practical, my father's dismissive tone suggesting it wasn't serious enough, Marcus's condescending explanation of why a different path would be better. I became my own harshest critic, their expectations so deeply embedded in my psyche that I didn't need them physically present to feel their disapproval. Even my dreams were shaped by their limitations. I'd catch myself fantasizing about futures they would approve of rather than futures that genuinely excited me, And when I noticed myself doing this, I'd feel a complicated mixture of shame and resignation. The suffocating weight of family traditions and their vision for my life became most apparent as I approached major life milestones. When I graduated high school, there was never a conversation about what I wanted to study in college, only assumptions about what I should study. My parents had decided years earlier that I would pursue either medicine or law, the two acceptable paths in their worldview, and they presented this not as their preference but as obvious truth, the natural trajectory for someone with my grades and their family background. When I tentatively suggested I might be interested in journalism or creative writing, my father actually laughed, not a warm laugh, but that dismissive chuckle that communicated how absurd he found the suggestion. My mother went into full panic mode, sitting me down for a series of conversations about being realistic and thinking about my future, and not throwing away my potential on something so unstable and impractical. She pulled out statistics about unemployment in creative fields, horror stories about struggling artists, and passionate speeches about the importance of financial security. What she never once asked was what would make me happy, what felt authentic to my interests and abilities, what kind of life I wanted to build for myself. Those questions simply didn't factor into their calculus because in their worldview, happiness was a byproduct of success, and success had one very narrow definition. I ended up choosing pre-law as my major, not because it interested me even slightly, but because it was the path of least resistance, the choice that would buy me temporary peace and their temporary approval. Those 4 years of college were some of the most soul-crushing of my life. I'd sit in classes about constitutional law and legal theory, surrounded by students who were genuinely passionate about the material, and feel this growing sense of wrongness, like I was wearing clothes that didn't fit, speaking a language that wasn't my native tongue. Every paper I wrote, every exam I took, every achievement in this field that wasn't mine, felt like another brick in a prison I was building around myself. But I kept going because I'd become so skilled at ignoring my own feelings, so practiced at prioritizing their approval over my own authentic desires. My parents were thrilled, of course. Finally, I was doing something they could understand and value, something they could mention proudly at their social gatherings. My father even started introducing me as his daughter, who was going to be a lawyer, as if my entire identity could be reduced to this future profession I'd never chosen for myself. The summer after my junior year, I was supposed to take the LSAT and start applying to law schools. This was the plan, the trajectory that had been set in motion years earlier, and everyone assumed I would simply continue following it. But something was happening inside me, a growing rebellion that I could no longer ignore or suppress. I'd started keeping a journal, writing down my real thoughts and feelings for the first time in years, and seeing my authentic voice on paper made it harder and harder to continue living this inauthentic life. I'd write about the classes I wished I could take, the career I actually wanted to pursue, the life I dreamed of building, and then I'd close the notebook and go back to pretending, go back to performing the role of the dutiful daughter on the path to respectable success. The contradiction was tearing me apart, creating this internal civil war between who I was and who I was pretending to be. I started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night with this crushing weight on my chest, my heart racing, feeling like I couldn't breathe. I'd lie there in the darkness of my dorm room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I could maintain this charade, wondering what would happen if I finally told the truth. The thought of disappointing them, of facing their anger and disappointment and judgment was terrifying, but continuing down this path was slowly killing something essential inside me. Have you ever felt trapped by other people's expectations to the point where you couldn't even remember what you actually wanted? Where the voices in your head telling you what you should do had become so loud that your own authentic voice was barely a whisper? That's where I was, standing at this crossroads between the life they wanted for me and the life I desperately needed to live. My first acts of rebellion were small, almost pathetically small in retrospect, but at the time they felt monumental, acts of courage that required every ounce of strength I could muster. It started the summer after college graduation, when I was supposed to begin law school in the fall. I'd been accepted to several prestigious programs. My parents were over the moon, and everyone was congratulating me on this wonderful achievement that felt like a death sentence. Instead of immediately committing to one of the schools, I asked for a gap year. I framed it carefully, strategically, talking about how taking some time to gain real-world experience before starting law school would make me a stronger candidate, how many successful attorneys had taken similar paths, how it was actually the smart and mature choice. Inside, I was trembling, waiting for their reaction, prepared for them to see through my carefully constructed arguments to the truth. I was stalling, buying time, desperately hoping that something would change in the intervening year that would make it possible for me to escape this predetermined path. My father was skeptical, questioning why I needed to delay when I'd already been accepted, suggesting that taking time off might make it harder to get back into academic mode. My mother worried aloud about what people would think, how she would explain to her friends why her daughter wasn't starting law school immediately after graduation. But eventually, worn down by my persistence and perhaps sensing that pushing too hard might lead to a larger rebellion, they reluctantly agreed, though they made it clear this was conditional approval, granted with the explicit understanding that I would enroll the following year. That summer, I got a job at a local newspaper. Nothing glamorous, mostly grunt work and fact-checking and occasional opportunities to write small pieces. To my family, this was exactly what I'd claimed it would be. Relevant experience that would strengthen my eventual law school applications. But to me, it was something entirely different. It was the first time I'd done something because I wanted to. The first time I'd followed my own interests rather than their blueprint for my life. I loved it. I loved the chaotic energy of the newsroom, the thrill of chasing down stories, the satisfaction of seeing my words in print, even when it was just a 200-word piece about a local event. I'd stay late not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because for the first time in my life, I'd found work that felt meaningful and engaging rather than obligatory. My colleagues became my friends, people who shared my interests and passions, who understood the appeal of this career in ways my family never would. For the first time, I felt like I was part of a community where I belonged, where my particular skills and interests were valued rather than dismissed. But I couldn't fully enjoy it, because hanging over everything was the knowledge that this was temporary, that at the end of the summer I would have to give it up and return to the path that had been chosen for me. As the months passed, I found myself making tiny choices that deviated slightly from expectations. I cut my hair shorter than my mother preferred, a small act of bodily autonomy that she noticed immediately and criticized repeatedly. I started dressing in a way that felt more authentic to me, less concerned with projecting the image of respectable young professional they preferred, and more focused on comfort and personal style. I began spending more time with friends they didn't know and hadn't vetted, people from the newspaper whose values and lifestyles didn't align with the conservative suburban world my family inhabited. Each small choice was an act of defiance, a tiny assertion of my right to make my own decisions, and each one was met with comments, concerns, and subtle pressure to conform. The tension was building, month by month, as the start of law school approached, and I still hadn't committed to a program. I'd been accepted with deferrals, so technically my spot was waiting for me, but I couldn't bring myself to take that final step, to officially commit to this future I didn't want. My parents' patience was wearing thin, their supportive tolerance of my gap year transforming into increasingly direct pressure to make a decision. The conversations became more frequent and more intense, my mother calling me almost daily to discuss various programs and their merits, my father sending me articles about the importance of prompt decision-making and not squandering opportunities. Then came the August evening when I knew I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I was sitting at my desk at the newspaper, working on an article I was genuinely excited about, when my phone rang. It was my mother, calling to tell me she'd been talking to the admissions office at her preferred law school, and they needed to hear from me by the end of the week or they'd give my spot to someone else. Something in the urgency of her voice, the assumption that this deadline would force my hand, made everything crystallize. I realized I'd been living in this strange limbo, neither fully pursuing what they wanted, nor fully embracing what I wanted. And this perpetual state of indecision was its own kind of prison. The lifestyle they couldn't accept wasn't anything radical or extreme, which is part of what made their reaction so painful and illuminating. I wasn't asking to join a commune or travel the world without any plans or pursue something genuinely dangerous or irresponsible. All I wanted was to build a career in writing and content creation, to work independently rather than in a traditional corporate structure, to define success on my own terms rather than theirs. But to them, this represented everything they feared: instability, rejection of tradition, deviation from the prescribed path to respectable adulthood. When I finally told them I wasn't going to law school, that I wanted to continue working in journalism and eventually build a career as a freelance writer and content creator, their reactions revealed just how deep the disconnect between us really was. My father went silent, that terrible silence that was somehow worse than yelling, his face turning red as he processed what he clearly saw as a betrayal of everything he'd invested in me. My mother immediately started crying. Not quiet tears, but full sobbing, as if I'd announced I was terminally ill rather than simply choosing a different career path. The following weeks were brutal, filled with conversations that went in circles, arguments that resolved nothing, and a pervasive atmosphere of disappointment and anger that hung over every interaction. They tried everything: logical arguments about financial security, emotional manipulation about how much they'd sacrificed for my education, threats about cutting off support, guilt trips about what other people would think. They brought in reinforcements, having my brother and other relatives call me to add their voices to the chorus of disapproval. Marcus was particularly disappointing in these conversations, not because he was cruel, but because he genuinely couldn't understand why I would give up a secure, prestigious career for something so uncertain. He kept asking me questions like, "But what's your plan? And how will you make money?" As if the only valid career was one that came with a clear ladder to climb and a guaranteed paycheck. When I tried to explain that I was building something different, that success didn't have to look the way he defined it, he'd just shake his head with that mixture of pity and confusion that suggested he thought I was having some kind of breakdown. My mother focused her efforts on trying to understand what had gone wrong, as if my desire to choose my own path was a problem that needed diagnosing and fixing. She'd ask me things like, "Where did we go wrong? And what didn't we give you?" Completely missing that the issue wasn't what they'd given or not given, but their inability to see me as a separate person with my own dreams and desires. She mourned the daughter she thought she had, the one who was going to fulfill all her expectations and validate her parenting, without ever considering whether that daughter had ever really existed or was just a performance I'd maintained to keep the peace. She suggested therapy, not to help me process my feelings or support my decision, but to fix whatever was broken in me that was causing me to make such terrible choices. She researched articles about quarter-life crises and shared them with me, highlighting passages about how normal it was to feel lost in your 20s, but how important it was not to make permanent decisions based on temporary feelings. The implication was clear. My authentic desires and carefully considered choices were just a phase, a momentary confusion that would pass if I could just be patient and trust their wisdom. My father took a different approach, trying to use logic and facts to prove I was making a mistake. He created spreadsheets comparing the lifetime earning potential of lawyers versus writers, completely missing that I'd never chosen law in the first place, and that financial success wasn't my primary measure of a life well lived. He'd send me articles about the difficult economic realities facing journalists and freelancers, always with little comments like, "Just want you to have all the information," or "making sure you understand what you're getting into," as if I hadn't done extensive research myself. He couldn't seem to grasp that I'd made an informed choice that was different from what he would choose, that I understood the risks and was willing to accept them in pursuit of something more meaningful to me than financial security. What really threatened them, I came to realize, wasn't the practical aspects of my choice, but what it represented symbolically. My decision to pursue my own path challenged the fundamental assumptions they'd built their lives on: that there was one right way to live, that parental authority and wisdom should determine children's major life choices, that deviation from traditional success markers was inherently wrong and irresponsible. My refusal to follow their blueprint was, in their eyes, a rejection of them personally, a statement that their values and sacrifices and guidance weren't good enough. They couldn't separate my need for autonomy from their sense of identity as parents, couldn't understand that choosing differently wasn't the same as choosing against them. The breaking point conversation happened on a cold December evening, about 6 months after I'd definitively decided not to pursue law school. I'd been working at the newspaper and starting to build a freelance portfolio on the side, taking on small projects, creating content, slowly building the foundation for the career I actually wanted. I was living in a small apartment, supporting myself modestly but independently, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of alignment between my external life and my internal values. But my family couldn't see this. Every time we talked, every family gathering I attended, the undercurrent of their disapproval poisoned every interaction. They'd make little comments about my situation, ask pointed questions about my financial stability, mention friends' children who were doing well in traditional careers, always with this tone that suggested they were just waiting for me to realize my mistake and come crawling back to their approved path. This particular evening, I'd been summoned to a family dinner under the pretense of celebrating my father's birthday, but I knew from my mother's tight voice on the phone that there was another agenda. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense, charged with unspoken accusations and disappointments. We went through the motions of birthday celebration, the cake and the singing and the opening of gifts, but it all felt performative, like we were actors going through the script of a normal family, even though everyone knew something else was coming. After dinner, my father suggested we all move to the living room for coffee, and that's when the intervention began. That's really what it was, though they never called it that. An intervention. A carefully planned confrontation designed to break me down and bring me back into the fold. My mother started. her voice trembling with emotion as she talked about how worried she was, how she couldn't sleep at night thinking about my future, how she felt like she'd failed as a mother because I was throwing my life away. My father added his perspective, more controlled but equally damning, talking about responsibility and maturity and facing reality. Marcus chimed in with his concerned trolling, disguised as brotherly care, but really just reinforcing their message that I was making a terrible mistake. They took turns presenting their arguments, their concerns, their judgments, tag-teaming me with their combined disapproval. They'd clearly planned this, coordinated their approach, maybe even rehearsed what they would say. I sat there listening, feeling that old, familiar shrinking sensation, that desire to make myself smaller and more acceptable, that instinct to appease and apologize and promise to do better. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the months of living authentically, of experiencing what it felt like to make my own choices and build a life that reflected my values. Maybe it was exhaustion, the simple fact that I was tired of fighting, tired of defending my right to exist as myself. Maybe it was anger, the slow-burning fury that had been building as I realized just how little they actually knew or cared about who I really was. Whatever it was, instead of shrinking, I found myself expanding, sitting up straighter, looking each of them in the eye as they spoke. When they finally finished, there was this expectant silence, like they were waiting for me to break down, to admit they were right, to promise to change. Instead, I asked them a question I'd never dared ask before. Do any of you actually know me? The question seemed to genuinely confuse them. My mother started to say, of course they knew me. I was their daughter, but I cut her off. No, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I mean really know me. Do you know what makes me happy? What I'm passionate about? What kind of life feels meaningful to me? Or do you only know the version of me that you wanted me to be? The room went silent. My father looked uncomfortable. My mother's eyes were filling with tears again. Marcus was looking away. I continued, words pouring out that I'd been holding back for years. I told them about how exhausting it had been to constantly perform for their approval, how their love had always felt conditional on me meeting their expectations, how I'd spent my entire childhood and young adulthood trying to mold myself into their vision of who I should be. I told them about the panic attacks, the depression, the sense of wrongness that had pervaded my life when I was following their plan. I told them that I wasn't asking for their approval anymore, that I'd realized their approval came at too high a cost, the cost of my authentic self, my genuine happiness, my right to determine my own path. I told them that I loved them, but that I couldn't keep sacrificing my life to maintain their comfort with their vision of who I should be. My mother's response was to accuse me of being selfish, of not caring about their feelings, of putting my own desires ahead of the family. My father said I was being dramatic and emotional and not thinking clearly. Marcus tried to mediate, suggesting that maybe we all needed to calm down and approach this more rationally. But something had shifted in me during that confrontation. For the first time in my life, their disapproval didn't devastate me. It hurt. Of course it hurt, but it didn't break me. I realized that I'd been so afraid of their judgment, so desperate for their approval, that I'd given them enormous power over my life and my sense of self-worth. And in that moment, sitting in their living room, facing their unified disapproval, I understood with startling clarity that I could simply choose to stop giving them that power. Their opinion of my choices didn't have to determine my opinion of myself. Their vision of success didn't have to be my vision. Their inability to see and value who I really was didn't mean there was something wrong with me. It meant there was something limited in their perspective. The painful journey to self-discovery that followed wasn't linear or easy. There were days when I questioned everything, when their voices of doubt in my head were almost deafening, when I wondered if they were right and I was making a terrible mistake. There were moments of intense loneliness, grieving the family closeness I'd always wanted, but never really had, missing the simplicity of just conforming, even as I knew I could never go back to living that way. I started therapy, really committed to it this time, not to fix what they thought was broken, but to understand myself better, to untangle their voices from my own, to heal the wounds that years of conditional love had created. My therapist helped me see patterns I'd never recognized before, how I'd internalized their criticism, how I sought approval from everyone because I couldn't get it from them, how my people-pleasing tendencies and difficulty setting boundaries all stemmed from those early experiences of having my authentic self rejected. I began the slow work of learning to trust my own judgment, to distinguish between their fears and my reality, to build a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on external validation. This work was hard. sometimes brutally hard. There were sessions where I sobbed, confronting the depth of pain I'd been carrying, the ways I'd been hurt by people who claimed to love me. There were moments of anger, finally allowing myself to feel furious at the years I'd lost trying to be someone I wasn't, at the way they'd prioritized their comfort and their image over my well-being and authenticity. There were periods of grief, mourning the parents I'd wished I had, the unconditional love I'd deserved but never received, the childhood innocence I'd lost too early when I learned that love came with conditions and expectations. I started setting boundaries, which was perhaps the hardest part of all. I limited contact with my family, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I stopped attending every family gathering, stopped answering every phone call, stopped explaining and defending and justifying my choices. I learned to say I'm not discussing this when they brought up my career or my lifestyle. I accepted that this might mean permanent distance between us, that they might never understand or accept my choices, and that this was sad but ultimately okay. I couldn't control their reactions or their feelings. I could only control my own responses and my own boundaries. Slowly, gradually, I began to build a life that was genuinely mine. My freelance career grew as I invested the energy I'd previously spent managing their disappointment into actually doing good work and building my skills. I created content that mattered to me, wrote articles about topics I cared about, built an online presence that reflected my authentic voice and values. I made friends who appreciated me for who I actually was, not who I pretended to be. I dated people who saw and valued my real self, rather than some idealized version. I discovered interests and passions I'd never had space to explore when I was busy performing acceptability. I learned what genuine joy felt like, not the conditional happiness that came from receiving approval, but the deep satisfaction that came from living in alignment with my values. I discovered that I was actually interesting, that my thoughts and perspectives had value, that my particular combination of skills and interests and personality traits made me someone worth knowing, even if my family couldn't see it. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you realized that seeking approval from people who refuse to see the real you is a losing game? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below because this journey can feel incredibly isolating, and knowing we're not alone in this struggle makes all the difference. Cutting the emotional umbilical cord. That's what my therapist called it, and it's a perfect metaphor for what had to happen. For years, my sense of self had been tied to them, to their opinions and their approval, as if they were still providing some essential sustenance I couldn't live without. Learning to sever that connection, to become truly emotionally independent, was terrifying in ways I hadn't anticipated. It meant accepting that they might never understand me, never approve of my choices, never give me the validation I'd spent my whole life seeking. It meant letting go of the fantasy of the perfect family reconciliation, where they suddenly saw the light and embraced me fully. It meant acknowledging that some relationships, even with family, might need to be more distant and superficial than we wish they were in order to protect our own well-being. The first time I really tested my new boundaries was my birthday, about 8 months after that confrontation. Traditionally, birthdays in my family were big deals, mandatory gatherings with extended family, elaborate meals, the whole production. My mother called weeks in advance to start planning my birthday dinner, talking about the guest list and the menu as if my attendance was a given. I listened to her plans, feeling that old familiar pull to just go along with it, to prioritize family harmony over my own comfort. But then I remembered all the previous birthday dinners, how they'd been more about performance than celebration, how even on a day supposedly about me, I'd felt the need to manage everyone else's expectations and present an acceptable version of myself. So I did something I'd never done before. I said no. I told my mother I wouldn't be attending a family birthday dinner this year, that I was making other plans, that I needed space. The reaction was immediate and intense. She was hurt, offended, confused. How could I not want to celebrate my birthday with family? What would people think? Who was I becoming? My father got on the phone, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, telling me I was being immature and hurtful, that family came first, that this behavior was unacceptable. I could feel the old panic rising, that desperate need to backtrack and apologize and fix everything. But I held firm. I didn't argue or explain beyond saying I'd made my decision and it wasn't up for debate. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, my mother's hurt feelings and my father's anger palpable even through the phone line. But when I hung up, I felt something unexpected. Relief. I'd survived saying no. The world hadn't ended. My birthday came and went, and I spent it with friends who actually knew and liked the real me. doing things I genuinely enjoyed rather than performing acceptable gratitude at an elaborate dinner that was more about my family's image than my happiness. It was one of the best birthdays I'd ever had, not despite the family drama, but partly because of it, because it represented a fundamental shift in my priorities and my willingness to honor my own needs. Over the following year, I continued to enforce boundaries and prioritize my own well-being over their comfort. I stopped pretending to be interested in the life paths they wished I'd chosen. I stopped apologizing for my choices. I stopped trying to convince them to see my perspective or understand my decisions. I accepted that we had fundamentally different values and visions for what makes a life worthwhile, and that this disconnect wasn't something I could or should try to fix. I focused instead on building the life I actually wanted, independent of their approval or disapproval. My freelance career continued to grow, evolving into full-time content creation and writing. I built a small but loyal audience who engaged with my work, people who found value in what I created, who appreciated my perspective and voice. I wrote about topics that mattered to me, explored ideas I found fascinating, created content that felt meaningful and authentic. For the first time, my work felt like an extension of who I was, rather than a performance or obligation. The financial success followed gradually, not in the explosive way they might have expected or demanded, but in sustainable growth that reflected genuine value I was providing. I reached a point where I was making a comfortable living, not wealthy by conventional standards, but secure enough, and more importantly, happy in a way I'd never been when I was following their prescribed path. My relationships improved across the board. When you stop performing for approval and start showing up authentically, you attract different kinds of people into your life. I found friendships that were deeper and more genuine than any I'd had before, based on mutual understanding and acceptance, rather than shared performance of acceptability. I dated people who were interested in who I actually was, rather than who I pretended to be, or who they wanted me to become. Some of these relationships worked out, some didn't, but all of them taught me valuable lessons about intimacy and authenticity, and the importance of being seen for who you really are. Perhaps most significantly, I developed a relationship with myself that had been completely absent before. I learned to listen to my own voice, to trust my own judgment, to value my own opinions and feelings. I discovered that I actually liked myself when I stopped trying to be someone else, that the person I was beneath all that performance and people-pleasing was someone interesting and worthwhile. I started treating myself with the kindness and respect I'd always craved from my family, but had never quite received. This isn't to say that cutting the emotional umbilical cord solved all my problems or eliminated all my struggles. There were still hard days, moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I'd made the right choice or if the cost of authenticity was too high. There were holidays that felt lonely, family events I wasn't invited to or declined to attend, milestones in my siblings' lives where my presence was barely tolerated. There were moments when I grieved the family I wished I had, when I felt the sting of their continued disapproval, when I caught myself still seeking their validation despite knowing better. Building my own definition of success was perhaps the most liberating and terrifying part of this entire journey. For so long, success had meant meeting their standards: prestigious career, financial security, conventional stability, markers of achievement they could understand and brag about. Rejecting their definition meant I had to figure out what success meant to me, which required being honest about my values and priorities in ways I'd never been before. I started making lists, trying to articulate what actually mattered to me. Not money, though financial stability was important. Not prestige, though I wanted to do work I could be proud of. Not their approval, though I had to remind myself of this constantly. What I kept coming back to was authenticity, creativity, connection, and meaning. I wanted to live authentically, as myself, rather than as a performed version of acceptability. I wanted to create things, to express ideas and perspectives, to make work that felt like a genuine extension of who I was. I wanted real connections with people, relationships based on mutual understanding rather than performance. And I wanted my life to feel meaningful, to matter in some way, even if that meaning was only significant to me and the people directly impacted by my work. This definition of success looked nothing like what I'd been raised to pursue, and that difference was both liberating and occasionally isolating. I couldn't measure my success against conventional markers like salary or job title or social status. Instead, I had to develop new metrics. Am I proud of the work I'm creating? Am I being true to my values? Do I feel fulfilled and engaged by what I'm doing? Are my relationships authentic and nourishing? Do I feel like I'm growing and evolving as a person? These questions became my compass, guiding decisions large and small. Building a career as a freelance writer and content creator required hustle and perseverance, and a willingness to be uncomfortable with uncertainty. There were months when money was tight, when I questioned whether I could really make this work, when it would have been so much easier to give up and pursue something more conventional. But I persisted because the alternative, going back to living inauthentically, felt like a kind of death. I learned to pitch ideas, to market myself, to handle rejection and criticism, to continuously improve my craft. I invested in my skills, taking courses and workshops, reading extensively, studying creators and writers I admired. I built a portfolio that reflected my genuine interests and abilities, rather than what I thought would be most impressive or acceptable. Slowly but steadily, my work found an audience. People resonated with the authenticity in my voice, with my willingness to explore ideas and experiences honestly rather than presenting some polished, performed version of reality. My channel Living Through It grew from a small passion project to something sustainable, a platform where I could share stories and perspectives that mattered to me and apparently mattered to others as well. The feedback I received from readers and viewers was unlike any validation I'd gotten from my family. It was based on what I actually created, on my real voice and perspective, on content that was genuinely mine rather than a performance of what someone else wanted me to be. People would comment about how my work helped them feel less alone, how my willingness to share my struggles and insights gave them permission to be more authentic in their own lives, how my perspective challenged them to think differently about their own choices and relationships. This kind of impact, this genuine connection with people who appreciated what I was actually offering rather than who they wanted me to be, was more fulfilling than any conventional success could have been. I also redefined success in my personal life, letting go of their timeline and expectations for relationships and family. I stopped feeling pressure to get married by a certain age or have children because it was expected, or buy a house in the suburbs because that's what responsible adults did. Instead, I let my personal life unfold organically, making choices based on what felt right for me rather than what would look right to them. This meant sometimes disappointing others, sometimes making choices that didn't align with conventional wisdom, sometimes standing alone in decisions that felt right even when they looked questionable to outside observers. But it also meant living with much less anxiety and much more peace, confident that my choices reflected my authentic values rather than borrowed expectations. Financial success came eventually, though it looked different than what they'd predicted. I wasn't making lawyer money, but I was supporting myself comfortably, building savings, investing in my future. More importantly, I felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with my bank account. Wealthy in time and autonomy. Wealthy in genuine relationships, wealthy in work that felt meaningful, wealthy in self-knowledge and authenticity. I realized that their definition of success had been oriented entirely toward external markers and comparisons, while my definition was oriented toward internal alignment and genuine fulfillment. Neither was objectively right or wrong, but only mine was right for me. The irony is that my success, by my own definition, has been far greater than anything I could have achieved following their path. Not because I'm making more money or have more prestige, but because I'm actually happy. Genuinely happy in a way I never was when I was trying to be who they wanted me to be. I wake up most mornings excited about my work rather than dreading it. I go to sleep most nights feeling satisfied with how I spent my day rather than anxious about whether I measured up to someone else's standards. I have relationships that nourish rather than drain me, work that engages rather than depletes me, a sense of purpose that comes from living authentically rather than performing acceptability. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found the courage to break away, if I'd continued down the path they'd chosen for me. I probably would have become a lawyer, maybe even a successful one by conventional measures. I might have made them proud, might have achieved the kind of success they could brag about to their friends, but I also know, with absolute certainty, that I would have been miserable. That the panic attacks and depression I experienced when I was living inauthentically would have only gotten worse. That I would have spent my entire life feeling like I was wearing someone else's skin, playing someone else's role, living someone else's life. The cost of their approval was nothing less than my authentic self, and that's simply too high a price to pay. My relationship with my family has evolved into something more distant, but also more honest. We're not close in the way I once wished we could be, but we're also not engaged in the constant battle that characterized those years when I was first breaking away. They've somewhat accepted that I'm going to live my life my way, though I don't think they'll ever truly understand or approve of my choices. We see each other occasionally, at major holidays or family events that are unavoidable. The conversations are polite but surface level. They ask about my work in that tone that suggests they're being supportive, while secretly hoping I'll eventually see the error of my ways. I share just enough to satisfy basic courtesy without opening myself up to criticism or unsolicited advice. It's not the warm, close family relationship I see in movies or read about in books, but it's peaceful, and that's worth something. Sometimes I feel sad about this distance, grieving the family closeness I'll never have. But mostly, I feel grateful. Grateful that I found the courage to break away before it was too late. Grateful for the life I've built on my own terms. Grateful for every hard lesson I learned along the way. Grateful for the people who have come into my life since I started living authentically, people who see and appreciate the real me. This journey of learning that I don't need their approval anymore has been the most important journey of my life. It's taught me that other people's opinions, even family's opinions, don't define your worth or determine your path. It's shown me that living authentically requires courage, but brings peace that performance never can. It's demonstrated that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and ultimately for others, is to set firm boundaries and refuse to compromise your essential self. If you're reading this, if you're watching this video, and you've experienced something similar, if you felt trapped by others' expectations or struggled to choose yourself over their approval, I want you to know you're not alone. This is one of the most common and most painful struggles people face, this conflict between who we are and who others want us to be. And I want you to know that choosing yourself, as scary and difficult as it might be, is not selfish. It's necessary. It's the foundation of genuine well-being and authentic happiness. You deserve to live a life that reflects your values, your interests, your authentic self, not someone else's vision of who you should be. So here's what I want you to do. First, comment below and tell me about your experience. Have you struggled with family expectations? Have you had to choose between their approval and your authentic self? What helped you through it? Or what's holding you back? I read every comment, and your stories matter, both to me and to everyone else navigating this difficult terrain. Understanding that we're not alone in this struggle is incredibly powerful. Second, if this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your heart or made you think differently about your own situation, please leave a like. It helps more people find this content, helps more people realize they're not alone in feeling trapped by others' expectations. Third, subscribe to Living Through It for more stories about navigating difficult life situations, choosing authenticity over approval, and building lives that actually feel worth living. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos, because I share stories every week about real struggles and real growth, and your engagement and support make this work possible. Most importantly, I want you to understand the deeper truth in this story. Seeking approval from people who refuse to see and value the real you is an unwinnable game. Their inability to appreciate your authentic self doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means their perspective is limited. Your worth is not determined by their ability to recognize it. Living authentically might cost you some relationships, might mean setting boundaries that feel uncomfortable, might require disappointing people whose approval you've spent your whole life seeking. But the alternative, living as a performed version of yourself to maintain their comfort, costs you something even more precious. It costs you yourself, your genuine happiness, your authentic life. And that's simply too high a price to pay. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story, for being part of this community where we can share our struggles and support each other through the difficult work of choosing ourselves. Remember, you don't need anyone's permission to live authentically, not even your family's. Your life belongs to you, and you have every right to build it in whatever shape feels true and meaningful to you. Please, if this video spoke to you, engage with it, share your thoughts, and help this message reach others who need to hear it. Together, we're building a community of people who have chosen authenticity over approval, and that's something truly powerful.